It all began on a quiet Thursday morning, the kind where the sun lazily crept over the rooftops and the neighborhood still smelled faintly of dew and freshly cut grass. The small suburban community of Willow Bend had always been known for its pristine lawns, perfectly painted fences, and overly involved homeowners association. It wasn't a bad place to live, at least, not until the HOA decided that perfection meant control. The trouble started when Mark, a relatively new homeowner, decided to replace the dull yellow porch light that came with his house. It was an old, flickering bulb that barely illuminated the walkway at night, leaving the front yard in near darkness. Mark, who worked late shifts, wanted something brighter, something that would make him feel safer coming home after midnight. So, he ordered a sleek LED fixture that glowed with a crisp white light, bright enough to chase away the shadows without being overwhelming. That small change, however, would become the spark that ignited a full-blown neighborhood war. 3 days after the new light went up, a neatly folded envelope appeared taped to Mark's front door. The HOA logo was stamped on the top in gold foil, and beneath it, in cold, bureaucratic language, was a notice of violation. According to the letter, Mark's porch light was non-compliant with neighborhood aesthetic standards, and he was required to restore the original fixture within 7 days, or face a $100 fine per day. Mark read it twice, blinking in disbelief. The letter wasn't signed by a board, but by one person, Karen Whitmore, the HOA president. She was infamous in Willow Bend for her obsession with the rules. Rules she interpreted however she saw fit. She lived 3 houses down, in a meticulously groomed 2-story with white shutters and flower boxes that matched the exact shade of her mailbox. Her yard looked like a magazine cover, but her personality was more like a legal notice, dry, rigid, and coldly precise. Mark initially thought it was a misunderstanding. After all, his new light wasn't offensive or flashy. It was modern, clean, and practical. He figured maybe Karen hadn't seen it in person and only assumed it was inappropriate. So, he ignored the letter for a day, planning to email the HOA and clear things up. But by the next morning, another letter appeared, this time slid under his door. It was shorter, sharper, and unmistakably personal. Failure to comply will result in immediate penalties. The show's authority is final. No greeting. No signature beyond President Whitmore. Just a threat wrapped in official stationery. That's when Mark began to notice the eyes. His neighbors, people who once waved or smiled politely, now avoided eye contact. A few whispered as he walked past, glancing up at his house like it had grown horns. It seemed Karen had already spread word that he was causing issues with the association. By the 5th day, a small orange sticker appeared on his mailbox reading, HOA noncompliance under review. It looked almost like a scarlet letter warning the rest of the street that he was a troublemaker. Mark finally emailed the HOA, attaching photos of his light, its specifications, and even pointing out that several other homes had similar fixtures. Hours later, a reply came, not from the OA as a group, but directly from Karen. She claimed his light was excessively bright and disruptive to community harmony. No mention of measurements or standards, just her opinion presented as law. That night, Mark stood outside, looking up at his porch light. It glowed steadily, casting a soft white halo over his steps. There was nothing offensive about it. But across the street, Karen's blinds fluttered. A silhouette lingered behind them, watching. The following morning, Mark received a formal fine notice. The HOA had escalated the situation to level 2 enforcement. Whatever that meant, he was now being charged $100 for each day he refused to remove the light. He had 2 options: comply quietly or push back, and Mark wasn't the type to be bullied into submission. He began researching the HOA's bylaws late into the night, combing through every tedious clause and cross-reference. To his surprise, he discovered that the lighting section was vague and outdated. It mentioned decorative uniformity and soft illumination, but nothing about brightness limits or fixture types. There was no rule that specifically prohibited his light. The next day, he printed out the section and taped it to his door right beside the violation notice. It was a silent message, proof that he knew his rights. But Karen didn't like being challenged. That evening, as Mark was arriving home, he saw Karen standing in front of his house with a clipboard and 2 board members. They were taking photos, measuring angles, and writing notes. One of them even aimed a small light meter at his porch. It was absurd, like a crime scene investigation for a light bulb. The next morning, Mark's email pinged again. Another violation. Another fine. Karen claimed she had documented evidence that his light exceeded acceptable brightness and disrupted neighborhood visual cohesion. It was nonsense, but the fines kept stacking. At this point, most people would have given up, but not Mark. He decided that if Karen hated his porch light so much, maybe she deserved to see what real brightness looked like. Over the next week, Mark began making trips to the hardware store. Boxes arrived at his doorstep labeled LD floodlight, solar path kit, and RGB string lighting. He spent his evenings in the garage assembling fixtures, testing colors, and wiring timers. It was meticulous work, but each bulb felt like a small act of rebellion. When Saturday night came, Willow Bend experienced something it would never forget. As darkness fell, Mark's house came alive in a blaze of white and color. His porch light looked modest now, barely a spark compared to the illumination erupting from his yard. Floodlights washed over the driveway, solar strips traced his fence line, and soft glowing string lights danced along his roof. It wasn't tacky, it was beautiful. The entire corner of the street glowed like a holiday celebration in the middle of June. From across the street, Karen's blind snapped open. Her face, half hidden by the glare, looked pale with fury. That night, as she stormed out of her house with her phone in hand, Mark simply smiled to himself, because now he knew the war had only just begun. And in Willow Bend, wars with the HOA were never small. The morning after Mark's house lit up like a suburban aurora, Willow Bend was buzzing. Neighbors stepped out in their robes and slippers, shielding their eyes as they gawked at the glow that still lingered even after sunrise. Children pointed. Dogs barked. Someone muttered that it looked like a theme park had moved in overnight. By noon, photos of Mark's house had already made their way into the neighborhood Facebook group. Some people laughed, others were outraged, but everyone had an opinion. And at the center of it all, fuming behind her pristine white curtains, was Karen Whitmore. She'd spent years crafting Willow Bend into what she called a sanctuary of uniform excellence. Every house painted within an approved palette. Every mailbox identical in design. Every lawn measured and mowed to perfection. To her, Mark's illuminated fortress wasn't just a violation. It was a declaration of war. That same afternoon, Mark found a thick envelope in his mailbox stamped URGM2ION. Inside was a cease and desist notice, multiple citations, and a formal summons to attend an emergency compliance hearing. The document listed no fewer than 9 new violations, including light pollution, visual disturbance, public nuisance, and, most absurdly, reckless endangerment of neighborhood harmony. Mark couldn't help but laugh. The HOA had gone from petty to ridiculous in less than 24 hours. But beneath the amusement, he felt something else brewing, a challenge. Karen wasn't going to stop, and neither was he. That evening, the neighborhood streets were unusually quiet. Cars slowed as they passed his house, headlights reflecting off the dazzling array of lights still shining bright. Some drivers honked and waved in amusement, while others shook their heads disapprovingly. But no one dared to speak up publicly, not against Karen. She ruled the HOA with an iron clipboard. The emergency hearing was scheduled for Wednesday at the community clubhouse, a small brick building near the entrance of the subdivision that Karen treated like her personal courtroom. When Mark arrived, the parking lot was already half full. Inside, rows of folding chairs faced a long table where Karen sat flanked by 2 other board members. She wore her usual pastel blazer, but her tight-lipped smile betrayed fury. The meeting began with a monotone recitation of violations. Karen's voice was cold, precise, dripping with authority. She described his lights as offensive, unsafe, and inconsistent with community standards. She even claimed several neighbors had filed formal complaints, though Mark suspected those complaints all came from her. When it was his turn to speak, Mark remained calm. He pointed out that the HOA's own bylaws contained no measurable standard for outdoor lighting. He even brought copies, highlighting the vague language that Karen had twisted into her crusade. He explained that his lights were energy efficient, motion-censored, and fully within legal brightness limits. But Karen wasn't interested in facts. She only saw defiance. When the vote came, the 2 board members hesitated. One looked uncomfortable. The other avoided eye contact altogether. Still under Karen's glare, they both voted yes to uphold the violations. The motion passed, 3-0. The fines would continue until all non-compliant lighting was removed. Mark left the clubhouse in silence. But as he stepped into the night air, a thought sparked in his mind. If Karen wanted to escalate things, she'd see just how bright he could shine. That weekend, Mark expanded his project. He installed smart timers, synchronized patterns, and even added soft amber uplighting to his trees. He wasn't trying to annoy anyone. It was art. His house now glowed like a gentle beacon, tasteful yet undeniably bold. And once again, the neighborhood took notice. But Karen didn't just fume this time. She plotted. By Monday morning, she had filed a complaint with the county zoning office, claiming Mark's lighting created a safety hazard for motorists. She even submitted photos, though she'd deliberately taken them at exaggerated angles to make the lights appear blinding. It was a devious move. If the county got involved, the matter could go beyond HOA politics. Sure enough, a white SUV with the county seal appeared on his street 2 days later. A zoning inspector stepped out, clipboard in hand, and began taking readings. Mark walked out to greet him, explaining the situation and showing that his lights met all legal standards. The inspector seemed understanding, even amused. He took a few notes and left, assuring Mark that there was no violation under county code. That small victory made Karen livid. Within hours, another letter appeared on his door. This time, it wasn't just about the lights. Karen claimed his yard modifications violated landscaping uniformity rules. She accused him of altering property appearance without prior HOA approval, referencing his lighting setup as unauthorized construction. She was stretching the rules now, trying to find anything that would stick. Mark realized she wasn't protecting the neighborhood, she was protecting her ego. Behind closed doors, neighbors began whispering. Some thought Mark was brave. Others feared Karen's retaliation. A few even confided in him quietly, sharing stories of their own battles with her. How she'd find people for wind chimes, seasonal wreaths, or even mismatched garbage cans. Mark wasn't the first target, but he might be the first to fight back publicly. That night, while sitting on his porch under the soft hum of his lights, Mark thought about what to do next. He could keep pushing, keep outsmarting her at every turn. But he also knew that Karen wouldn't stop until she felt humiliated, or removed from power. Then, an idea came to him. Something bold, something public. If she wanted to make his lighting an issue for the entire neighborhood, maybe it was time to make lighting the neighborhood's new obsession. He began sketching plans, browsing local permits, and reaching out quietly to a few sympathetic neighbors. It took a week of quiet preparation, but by the end of it, his idea was ready. Karen wouldn't see it coming. Because Mark wasn't just going to light up his house anymore. He was going to light up every house that wanted to stand against her. And in doing so, he'd turn her own obsession with control into her downfall. As the week came to an end and the HOA prepared for another routine inspection, the air in Willow Bend felt charged. Change was coming. The neighborhood didn't know it yet, but soon the quiet cul-de-sac that once feared Karen Whitmore would blaze with a light she could never dim. By the time the sun rose on the following Monday, Willow Bend had no idea that a quiet revolution was already underway. What began as one man's defiance against an unreasonable HOA president was about to evolve into something much bigger. A movement that would shake the very foundations of Karen Whitmore's rule. Mark had spent the week planning meticulously. He knew he couldn't outmatch the HOA through rules or fines. Karen had the board, the bureaucracy, and the legal technicalities on her side. But what she didn't have was the support of the people she claimed to represent. Over the years, she had alienated nearly everyone. Neighbors who once liked her had grown tired of her constant inspections, her clipboard crusades, her endless letters threatening corrective action. Mark realized that if he could unite those people, he could do something no one had dared to do before: stand up to her publicly. He started small. Quiet conversations over fences, casual chats at the mailbox, short, whispered exchanges at the community park. He didn't push, he listened. And what he heard confirmed what he already suspected. Karen had fined a retired couple for leaving their Christmas lights up too long. She had demanded that a family repaint their front door because the color wasn't on the approved palette. She had even made a single mother pay $200 for hanging a small wind chime that violated auditory tranquility standards. Every story added another spark to the fire. Within days, a dozen neighbors were on board, then 2 dozen, then nearly half the street. They all had one thing in common. They were tired of being bullied, of living under the constant surveillance of a woman who acted like she owned the neighborhood. And so, Mark introduced his plan, Operation Lightstorm. The idea was simple but powerful. On a designated night, every participating homeowner would light up their house in solidarity. Not in a gaudy, obnoxious way, but beautifully, tastefully, brightly. It would be a show of unity, a declaration that they would no longer live in the dark under Karen's rules. Each house would shine together, forming a wave of light that would flood Willow Bend from one end to the other. The reaction from his neighbors was electric. People who had been too afraid to speak up now smiled as they helped string bulbs and install timers. Someone lent Mark their old projector lights. Another neighbor volunteered to make flyers, anonymously, of course. The message was simple: light up for freedom. This Saturday night. The movement spread quietly but steadily. Some whispered about it at the grocery store, others shared coded messages in the neighborhood group chat, careful not to trigger Karen's watchful eye. And as the day approached, anticipation filled the air. Karen, however, could sense something was brewing. She saw neighbors working in their yards more than usual. She noticed extension cords snaking across driveways, lights being tested at dusk. She sent out yet another HOA bulletin, warning against unapproved lighting modifications, and reminding residents that all exterior illumination required board review. But this time, her threats were met with silence. No one replied. No one submitted forms, and that silence was louder than any protest. When Saturday night arrived, Willow Bend looked deceptively calm. The streets were quiet. The air was still. Karen stood at her window, suspicious but uncertain, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. She'd spent the evening drafting emails and warning the board that something was going on. But even she couldn't prepare for what came next. At exactly 8:00 p.m., it began. First, Mark's house lit up, a brilliant white glow sweeping across the facade like a rising sun. Then, one by one, other houses followed. A cascade of light rippled down the street as porches, roofs, fences, and trees illuminated in harmony. Within minutes, the entire block was glowing, warm whites, soft ambers, golden tones that shimmered together in perfect unison. It wasn't chaos, it wasn't tacky. It was beautiful, peaceful, united. Karen rushed out onto her porch, her jaw slack as she stared at the spectacle. Her once perfect neighborhood, her symbol of control, now shone with defiance. Every bulb, every strand, every soft beam of light was a reminder that her authority was only as strong as the people who obeyed it. She began snapping photos furiously, muttering to herself as she documented evidence. But for every picture she took, another house lit up. Within 10 minutes, nearly the entire subdivision was glowing. Even the homes that hadn't been directly involved switched on their porch lights, hesitant at first, but eventually joining in. The unity was contagious. Mark stood on his driveway, arms crossed, watching as the neighborhood transformed. He didn't shout. He didn't gloat. He just smiled, knowing that this was no longer about him or his porch light. It was about everyone who had ever been told to fall in line, who had ever been threatened with a fine for something as simple as being themselves. Cars slowed as they passed by, some stopping to take pictures. Someone uploaded a video to social media, a sweeping panorama of the glowing neighborhood with the caption, "Joe President banned porch lights, so we lit up the whole street." Within hours, that video went viral. By midnight, comments and shares were pouring in. People from across the country cheered them on, sharing their own HOA horror stories. Hashtags like the Light Up for Freedom and Fatal Wars began trending locally. The next morning, local news vans showed up at the entrance of Willow Bend. Reporters interviewed neighbors, capturing the shimmering aftermath of the previous night's rebellion. Karen was furious. She sent out a fiery email condemning the unauthorized event and threatening immediate legal action. But the damage was done, not to the neighborhood, but to her reputation. For years, she had ruled through intimidation and isolation. Now, she faced something she had never encountered before: unity. By Monday, the HOA board called an emergency session. Several members, embarrassed by the media attention, began questioning Karen's leadership. The more she ranted about light pollution and non-compliance, the more ridiculous she sounded. The board quietly decided to review her authority to issue fines without a vote. Karen's empire was cracking. Mark, meanwhile, stayed calm. He didn't engage with her directly. He simply let the light do the talking. And for the first time in Willow Bend's history, the neighborhood looked alive, not like a collection of identical houses, but like a community. But Karen wasn't done. Beneath her public outrage was something deeper: humiliation. She had lost control, and she wasn't about to give it up without a fight. If she couldn't destroy Mark through the HOA, she'd find another way. She began digging, through old bylaws, property records, even county regulations, searching for anything she could use to bring him down. And soon, she found something, a loophole, a technicality buried deep within the HOA's charter that could give her the power to escalate things beyond the board, straight into legal territory. The battle wasn't over. It was only getting started. For a brief moment, Willow Bend had felt free. The houses glowed, the neighbors smiled, and the heavy air of fear that had lingered for years seemed to lift. But peace never lasts long when power is threatened. And for Karen Whitmore, the HOA president whose identity revolved around control, that peace felt like defeat. After the light storm, Karen's authority was publicly questioned for the first time. Her name had become a joke on social media, her face plastered across viral posts mocking her obsession with porch lights. The HOA board had grown quiet around her, reluctant to support her after the PR disaster. But humiliation does something strange to people like Karen. It sharpens their need to strike back. For days, she scoured through old HOA documents, flipping through dusty binders, scanning every outdated policy and amendment. Most of the rules had been written decades ago by the community's original developers, and over the years, many had become irrelevant or forgotten. But then, buried deep in a section titled Architectural and Safety Provisions, she found what she was looking for. A clause so obscure and old-fashioned that no one even remembered it existed. The clause stated that any exterior modification, perceived to alter the uniform safety appearance of the neighborhood, could be subject to mandatory HOA-led inspection and, if deemed unsafe or non-standard, could result in a forced correction order. The rule was vague, archaic, and poorly worded, but it was a weapon. Karen realized that while she couldn't find Mark effectively anymore, she could claim that his electrical setup posed a fire hazard. It was the perfect angle. Safety regulations weren't subjective, they were enforceable by both the HOA and, if necessary, the county fire marshal. If she could prove that Mark's lighting violated electrical codes, she could not only force him to remove it, but also make him look reckless in front of everyone who supported him. She wasted no time. Within days, she sent a formal letter to Mark, citing Section 14B of the Willow Bend Safety Ordinance, and demanding a full inspection of his property by a certified HOA inspector. Of course, that inspector was her cousin, an unlicensed handyman she frequently used for official inspections. The letter stated that refusal to comply would result in legal escalation. When Mark received the letter, he could almost feel the venom dripping off the page. He knew it was nonsense. His wiring was professionally installed, and everything was up to code. But Karen wasn't playing by the rules anymore. She was creating her own. He decided to handle it differently this time. Instead of reacting in anger, he documented everything. He photographed every cable, every connection, every switch, and every receipt from the licensed electrician who had done the installation. He even recorded a video walkthrough, explaining how everything was code, compliant, and safe. But Karen didn't care about evidence. She cared about appearances. That weekend, she showed up unannounced with her cousin, clipboard in hand, demanding access to his property for inspection. Mark calmly refused, citing his right to deny entry without a court order. She fumed, calling him uncooperative and a risk to community safety. Her cousin awkwardly stood beside her, unsure what to do as she ranted about endangering children and property values. When she realized Mark wasn't backing down, she made her next move. She filed a formal complaint with the county fire department. She claimed that his lighting system was improperly wired and posed a significant electrical hazard. It was a blatant lie, but it was enough to trigger an official inspection. Days later, a marked county vehicle pulled into Willow Bend. 2 uniformed fire safety officers stepped out, clipboard and toolkits in hand. Karen followed them like a shadow, pretending to be helpful, pointing dramatically at Mark's lights as if she had just saved the community from disaster. Neighbors peeked through blinds, whispering as the officers entered Mark's property. The inspection was thorough but uneventful. The officers checked everything, ran voltage tests, and examined the wiring. Mark provided all documentation, invoices, and even the electrician's certification. The men nodded approvingly and left without finding a single violation. The following morning, Mark received an official letter, all systems in compliance. No further action required. It should have been over. But for Karen, this wasn't about safety. It was about revenge. When the inspection failed to incriminate him, she switched tactics yet again. She began pushing a new HOA amendment that would ban all non-standard exterior lighting outright. If she couldn't win under current rules, she'd rewrite them. She called it the Neighborhood Aesthetic Restoration Initiative, dressing it up as a proposal to restore visual unity and tranquility. In reality, it was a targeted strike, a rule that would make Mark's lights illegal retroactively. Her plan was to hold a special community vote to ratify it. She began canvassing door to door, knocking with her clipboard and smile that didn't reach her eyes. She framed it as protecting property values and reducing energy waste. Some neighbors, fearful of more conflict, agreed. Others avoided her completely. But something unexpected happened. The majority didn't want to sign. Mark's quiet conversations, his kindness, his willingness to help people install their own lights, it had built something powerful. A sense of community that Karen had spent years crushing was now thriving again. People weren't afraid anymore. They were tired of her manipulation. On the night of the vote, the community clubhouse was packed. Dozens of residents filled the seats, many wearing small pins shaped like light bulbs, a subtle nod to the movement Mark had started. Karen stood at the front, trying to maintain composure as she presented her initiative. Her words were polished, but her tone trembled with frustration. She could feel the room slipping away from her. When the votes were counted, the result was undeniable. The motion failed overwhelmingly. Karen's face went pale. The board members shifted awkwardly, avoiding her glare. The residents applauded quietly, some even cheering. Mark stood at the back, saying nothing, but his smile said everything. Karen gathered her papers and stormed out, her heels clacking against the tile like gunshots. She had lost, publicly, completely. But as she walked out into the night, the faint glow of porch lights shimmered across the street. Each one seemed to mock her, to remind her that she no longer controlled this place. Still, her mind was already spinning. She wasn't done yet. That night, she filed a lawsuit, not through the HOA but personally. She accused Mark of harassment, defamation, and intentional distress. It was baseless, but it would drag him into court, cost him time and money, and maybe, just maybe, break his resolve. The next phase of the war had begun, and this time, the battlefield wasn't the neighborhood, it was the courtroom. When the lawsuit papers arrived, Mark wasn't even surprised. The thick envelope, stamped with official seals and Karen's name in bold print, felt almost inevitable. She'd lost the battle for control in the neighborhood, but Karen Whitmore wasn't someone who accepted defeat. She simply changed the arena. Now, she was bringing the fight to court. The document accused him of intentional emotional distress, public defamation, and malicious interference with HOA operations. It read like a bitter diary entry wrapped in legal jargon. She claimed that his campaign of light had damaged her reputation, subjected her to ridicule, and caused her severe psychological suffering. In her eyes, she was the victim, the martyr of her own imagined crusade. Mark sat at his kitchen table, reading the claims line by line. Each accusation was more absurd than the last. But he knew this wasn't about truth. It was about exhaustion. Karen wanted to drown him in paperwork, force him to spend thousands on lawyers, and break him through stress and fear. For a moment, he considered settling, just paying to make it all go away. But then he remembered the faces of his neighbors, the lights they'd proudly hung, the unity that had spread through Willow Bend because he refused to back down. No, he thought. This wasn't just about him anymore. He called a lawyer. The weeks that followed felt surreal. Karen's obsession deepened. She paraded around the neighborhood with newfound arrogance, boasting that justice was on her side. She told anyone who would listen that Mark was finally going to be held accountable. She even claimed that the HOA supported her, though in truth the board had distanced itself entirely, embarrassed by her antics. Local gossip spread fast. Some neighbors worried it would all get ugly. Others quietly reassured Mark that they were behind him, that they'd testify if needed. The same residents who had once feared Karen now pitied her. She was unraveling in real time, desperate, paranoid, consumed by the war she had started. The court date arrived on a gray morning in early spring. The courthouse loomed large and impersonal, its marble floors echoing with footsteps and whispers. Mark wore a plain suit. Karen, by contrast, arrived in a bright pastel blazer, her expression smug, her hair perfectly set. She clutched a thick binder labeled EVDNC, as though she were preparing to prosecute a national scandal. Inside the courtroom, her confidence cracked almost immediately. The judge, a patient but sharp-eyed woman, had little tolerance for theatrics. As Karen's attorney began presenting her claims, the lack of real substance became painfully clear. Most of her evidence consisted of social media posts and screenshots of news articles, all of which simply documented the neighborhood's light display. When it was Mark's turn, his lawyer calmly laid out the facts: the timeline of HOA harassment, the letters, the fines, the baseless safety inspections, and finally, the retaliatory lawsuit. Every document, every photo, every email painted a picture not of a victim, but of a woman who had abused her position for years. The moment that sealed it came when the judge asked Karen a simple question. Can you provide specific evidence that the defendant caused you harm outside of your role as OA president? Karen hesitated. Her lawyer shifted uncomfortably. She stammered about public humiliation and loss of authority, but her words only dug the hole deeper. The judge's tone turned cold. Loss of authority in a volunteer position, she said, is not grounds for damages. By the time the hearing ended, it was clear where things stood. The judge dismissed the majority of Karen's claims outright and warned that pursuing them further could result in sanctions for filing frivolous litigation. Karen's face went pale. For the first time, she looked small, stripped of the power she had wielded so freely for so long. Outside the courtroom, the reporters who had once filmed the Lightstorm event were waiting. Cameras flashed as Karen stormed past them, refusing to comment. Mark, meanwhile, spoke calmly, thanking the court for restoring reason to a neighborhood that had lost it. His words were simple, but they resonated. By evening, local news outlets ran the headline, "Oh, a president's lawsuit backfires. Judge sides with homeowner." Back in Willow Bend, the reaction was immediate. Neighbors gathered in driveways congratulating Mark, shaking his hand and laughing about how far things had gone. But behind every laugh was relief. Relief that Karen's reign of control was finally ending. The HOA board convened an emergency meeting that week. This time, Karen wasn't leading it. In fact, she wasn't even invited. One by one, board members voted to remove her from the presidency, citing abuse of authority and damage to community trust. It was a quiet, almost somber decision, the end of an era that no one would miss. When the letter arrived informing her of her removal, Karen didn't appear for days. Her blinds stayed closed. Her car didn't move. Rumor had it that she'd filed an appeal to keep her position, but no one cared anymore. The neighborhood had moved on. For the first time in years, Willow Bend felt peaceful. No violation notices, no surveillance, no arbitrary fines. The HOA meetings became less about punishment and more about projects. Garden improvements, community events, even a neighborhood barbecue. And through it all, the lights stayed on. It wasn't just about brightness anymore, it was about belonging. Each porch light that glowed after sunset was a quiet reminder of what they'd been through, of how one small act of defiance had restored their voice. Mark often sat on his porch at night, watching the warm shimmer ripple across the street. He had won, yes, but more importantly, the community had won. Karen's name faded from conversations, her memory reduced to a cautionary tale about control gone too far. But even as the neighborhood healed, one truth lingered. People like Karen never truly disappear. They retreat, they regroup, they wait. And somewhere, behind those closed blinds, she was already planning her next move. Something that would make sure the lights didn't shine forever. Because if Karen Whitmore couldn't rule Willow Bend anymore, she'd rather see it fall into darkness. For months after the courtroom victory, Willow Bend basked in an unfamiliar peace. The lawns were still green, the fences still white, but the neighborhood felt different, freer, lighter. The tension that had once lived in every trimmed hedge and painted curb had vanished. The residents no longer tiptoed under the invisible weight of HOA rules. The lights stayed up, glowing softly each evening. They became a symbol, not of rebellion anymore, but of unity. Families added subtle touches: fairy lights on porches, small lanterns in gardens, motion lights by the driveways. It wasn't about defying anyone. It was about remembering that they could make their homes their own again. Mark had returned to his quiet routines. He went to work, tended his yard, and waved at neighbors who now stopped to chat instead of rushing past. Children played in the cul-de-sac again, their laughter echoing through the warm air. For the first time since moving to Willow Bend, Mark felt like he truly belonged. But peace, as always, has its shadows. Karen Whitmore had vanished from public life after her removal as HOA president. Her blinds remained closed, her once perfectly manicured lawn now overgrown. The gossip varied. Some said she'd moved away, others whispered that she was still inside, stewing in resentment. Her house stood dark at night, the only one on the street without a light. Mark didn't think about her much anymore until one early summer morning when he found a letter in his mailbox. It wasn't official, no HOA logo, no typed paragraphs. Just a plain white envelope with his name scrawled in sharp, angular handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The message was short. You might have won the battle, but the light always burns out. No signature, no address. But he didn't need one. For a moment, he felt a chill. Then he laughed quietly to himself and tucked the letter away. Karen could threaten, whisper, or scheme all she wanted. She had no power anymore. The neighborhood had changed too much. People had seen what unity could do, and they weren't going back to fear. But that letter wasn't the last reminder of her. A week later, something strange began happening. One by one, the neighborhood's lights started failing. First, it was a flicker at the end of the street. Then another. By the third night, entire sections of the block were dark. At first, people thought it was coincidence, maybe the weather, or a faulty transformer. But when the electricians arrived, they discovered something else entirely. The lines had been tampered with, cables cut, bulbs smashed, power boxes deliberately shorted. The damage was subtle but deliberate. Someone had gone house to house under the cover of night, dismantling the very lights that had become the heart of Willow Bend. Fear crept back into the neighborhood like a fog. Some residents stayed up late, watching from their windows. Others installed cameras. No one saw anything. When Mark checked his own lights, he found the wires snipped clean. A careful surgical cut. Whoever did it knew what they were doing, and deep down, he already knew who it was. That night, for the first time in months, Willow Bend went dark. The next morning, a noise broke the silence, a faint hum. Then, the slow whir of machinery. Karen's garage door opened. Her car, covered in dust, rolled down the driveway. She stepped out briefly, wearing sunglasses, her expression unreadable. Her lawn was a mess, her flower beds wilted. But there was a spark in her posture, a kind of twisted satisfaction. Neighbors watched from behind curtains, whispering. Without a word, she pulled a "for sale" sign from her trunk and planted it firmly in her front yard. Then she got back in her car and drove away. By evening, her house stood empty. No one came to visit. No moving trucks arrived. It was as if she'd simply erased herself from Willow Bend, leaving only the ghost of her presence behind. The tension that had crept back into the neighborhood began to fade once more. People sighed with relief, and soon enough, they began to repair their lights. Mark took the lead again. He helped rewire yards, replace bulbs, and organize volunteers. The neighborhood came alive with laughter and tools, neighbors helping neighbors. Within days, the soft glow returned, brighter, stronger, defiant in the face of darkness. That weekend, the community held a small gathering. No speeches, no formalities, just food, music, and the gentle shimmer of lights stretching down every street. Kids played, adults chatted, and even the air seemed warmer, lighter. When night finally fell, the entire neighborhood stood outside together. Mark flipped the main switch on his new setup, a synchronized system connecting every home's porch light. One by one, the bulbs came to life. The street glowed in perfect harmony, each home shining in unity with the others. The collective illumination washed over the cul-de-sac, reflecting in the windows, shimmering across cars and fences. It wasn't just light, it was freedom made visible. Somewhere in the distance, far beyond the neighborhood, a single figure stood on a hill overlooking Willow Bend. A woman, her hair pulled tight, her expression unreadable. The glow of the lights reflected faintly in her glasses before she turned and disappeared into the darkness. But no one saw her, and no one cared to, because Willow Bend no longer belonged to her. From that night forward, the lights never went out again. The residents maintained them year-round, not because they needed the brightness, but because they remembered what it meant. The HOA still existed, but it was no longer feared. It became what it was always meant to be, a community, not a dictatorship. The bylaws were rewritten, the power distributed fairly, and the residents vowed never to let one person control them again. And every evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Willow Bend came alive with light, steady, proud, and unbroken. It wasn't just a neighborhood anymore. It was a reminder that even in the darkest corners of suburban conformity, one spark, One person's refusal to back down can light up everything around them. And as long as those lights burned, the spirit of Willow Bend would never fade.